A man walks into a bar and says to the bartender, "Why are there 3 pieces of meat hanging from the ceiling?" And the bartender says, "If you can jump high enough to touch the meat, then you get free drinks for the whole night. But if you fail, you have to buy a drink for every other person in the bar. Want to try it?" The guy thinks for a minute and he says, "No thanks, the stakes are too high." Terrible joke, isn't it? But the guy wasn't willing to take a risk because he didn't want to suffer the consequences if he failed. My mum, who's in her 80s, lives with us, and every day she watches the same TV show. And on this show, the players get a chance of winning 3 different amounts of money. And every night, the contestants say to the team, "What shall I do?" And all the team members say to them, "Play it safe. We want you back on our team. Don't risk it." And they always go for the lower amount of money. But very occasionally, somebody will take a risk. They will go for the big money. And this morning, we're going to look at a couple of Bible characters who went for the big money, who took a risk, who stuck their necks out, who stepped out in faith without any guarantee of success. We've been looking at the book of Ruth and thinking about kingdom keys for challenging times. And Mike spoke to us the other week about staying faithful. And last week, Martin shared with us about finding hope. And today, the kingdom key that we're looking at is taking risk. You may remember that Naomi, her husband, and their 2 sons left Bethlehem and traveled to Moab. The husband dies. Naomi's sons marry Moabite women, but then the sons also die. Naomi hears that there's no longer a famine in Bethlehem, and she prepares to return to her homeland. She says to her daughters-in-law, "Stay here in Moab." But Ruth chooses to stick with Naomi, and she utters those famous words, "Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Ruth took a huge risk and left behind all that she'd ever known. And let's pick up the story in chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you'll be well provided for." Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight, he'll be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He'll tell you what to do. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant, Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it's true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he's not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you're wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" And then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." This chapter starts with a problem. And the problem is that Ruth is a childless widow living in a foreign land. There's no universal credit. There's no benefit system. Naomi won't be around forever. And she wants to find a home, a permanent place of rest for Ruth. She wants to see her settled and provided for. A very natural concern and a sentiment that's shared by any of us who have grown-up children. Naomi comes up with a plan. Could we have the PowerPoint on, please? Naomi comes up with a plan, and she tells Ruth to get washed, put on some perfume and her best clothes, and go and lie at Boaz's feet. Boaz has only ever seen Ruth dirty and sweaty from working in the fields. And Naomi's saying to Ruth, "Do yourself up, dear. Let Boaz notice how well you scrub up." People in mourning traditionally didn't spruce themselves up or put on their best clothes or make an effort with their appearance. And Naomi is indicating to Ruth that it's time to move on. Time to move on from mourning and what's happened in the past and to look to the future. And just maybe there are some people here this morning or listening online, and God's saying the same thing to you. It's time to move on. It's time to move on from the pain of your past and the grief over what's been lost. It's time to draw a line, to consciously choose not to dwell on the past, but to look forward to a new start. It's time to hope again. So Naomi tells Ruth to go to the threshing floor. Remember, it's harvest time, and once a crop's been harvested, it would be taken to a communal threshing floor where it had been beaten with sticks or hit with a sledge or trampled on by cattle to break up the husks. The broken husks would then be thrown into the air with a pitchfork in a process known as winnowing. The wind would catch the lighter husks and blow them away, leaving the heavier grain to fall to the ground where it would be gathered and bagged. The entire occasion was a time for great celebration and partying, even more so after years of famine. And the landowners would sleep next to the valuable harvest so that it wasn't stolen. So here's Boaz, laid next to the grain pile, fast asleep. His uncovered feet start to feel a bit chilly. He wiggles them about a bit to get the circulation going, and he feels something or someone at his feet. No wonder he asks, "Who are you?" Because Boaz probably wondered if a prostitute was there to tempt him, as prostitution was common on the threshing floor when men had had a few drinks. But Ruth identifies herself as his servant and says to Boaz in verse 9, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." Now you can just imagine the cogs turning in Boaz's mind, particularly with Ruth being a Moabite, whose entire race began when a young woman got her father drunk, climbed into bed, and seduced him. Read chapter 19 of Genesis. But Ruth isn't suggesting anything sexual. She's not jumping into bed with Boaz. This is an utterly public act on the communal threshing floor. Neither is Ruth saying, come on, let me share your blanket, it's a bit nippy down here. She's declaring her love for Boaz and inviting him to ask for her hand in marriage. Back in chapter 2, verse 12, Boaz had prayed that Ruth would be richly rewarded by the God of Israel, under whose wings she'd come to take refuge. And now, Boaz is given the opportunity to be the answer to his own prayer. The phrase, spread your garment, is sometimes translated, spread your wings. And in this act, a man demonstrated that he would both lovingly cover a woman for the entirety of her life and invite her into bed as his beloved wife. Spreading your garment or spreading your wings was a symbol for engagement, just like our current symbol of an engagement ring. And although Boaz had shown kindness to Ruth, he let her glean in his field, he'd offered her shelter and protection and provision, and he'd even pronounced a godly blessing over her. But the idea of marriage probably hadn't even crossed his mind. He's significantly older than Ruth. He's a Jew, an Israelite, a landowner, a man of standing. Ruth is a poor Gentile field hand from Moab. Ruth wasn't breaking any clear command of Scripture, but she was certainly trampling a few cultural taboos by making this request of Boaz. And Ruth wasn't just asking something for herself either. Otherwise, she would have stopped at spread your garment over me. But she goes on, for you are our Redeemer. This is for our wider family's sake. This is about you responding to God's word, about taking responsibility for those in need. It's about following God's plan of redemption and provision. And Naomi may have come up with the plan, but Ruth was taking an enormous risk. Boaz could have rejected her. He could have taken advantage of her. Ruth's reputation could have been damaged. And although Boaz is now aware of the possibility of him marrying a pretty young woman of noble character, there's still a problem in that there's another family member higher up the pecking order, and the law requires that he has first dibs at taking Ruth as his wife. Now, you're going to have to wait until next week to find out what happens. But suffice to say, Boaz has a plan. But he too has to take the risk of somebody else claiming Ruth. And he has to trust God to work things out. And chapter 3 ends with that dreaded 4-letter word, wait. Naomi says to Ruth in verse 18, wait until you find out what's happening. None of us like waiting. But sometimes that's exactly what God is asking us to do. God has perfect timing, but his time scale often isn't the same as ours. We want instant answers and solutions, but we need to be patient. There are so many stories throughout Scripture of people who didn't wait, who tried to help God out by making things happen. Abraham slept with his wife's maidservant to get an heir, rather than waiting for his elderly wife to conceive. Samson offered the sacrifice himself, rather than waiting for the prophet Samuel to arrive. Learning to wait on the Lord and trust in his timing can be a real challenge. But just as a baby who is born prematurely can face all sorts of issues, if we try to help God out and make things happen too soon, then we also can face a lifetime of complications. The other day, we were driving along and my grandson was in the back of the car, and he's getting a little bit impatient and kicking my seat, shouting, "It's a green light! Why aren't we going?" And I tried to explain that there was a big line of traffic in front of us, and we had to wait for the other cars to move out the way before we could go. But he was getting more and more frustrated, shouting, "Green means go, and we're not going. It's not fair." My grandson's 5, and he can be forgiven for his impatience. But even as adults, we can become frustrated and impatient when it seems as if God's given us a green light, but we have to wait for other things to move out of the way before we can move forward. We do well to heed the advice from Psalm 27, verse 14. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. So Ruth chapter 3 starts with a problem. Ruth was a widow who needed a permanent home. Naomi comes up with a plan. Ruth was to go to the threshing floor and ask Boaz to be her guardian redeemer. And then the chapter ends with another problem. There's somebody else other than Boaz who has the right to be Ruth's guardian redeemer. Let me ask you a question. Anybody here ever had a problem? We all face problems and challenging times. But I'd like to suggest that for every single problem we will ever face, God has a plan. Whatever obstacles stand in our way, however impossible or hopeless a situation may seem, God has a plan. He's not there scratching his head and thinking, oh no, how on earth do I get out of this one? He's not backed up against the wall in panic, frantically trying to find a solution. He has a plan. He's always had a plan. And he has a plan to prosper us, not to harm us. A plan to give us hope. A plan to give us a future. And that's the good news. But the bad news is that God's plan doesn't always look like our plan. In fact, God's plan sometimes doesn't even make sense to us, or it may look the exact opposite of the way that we would do things. And we need to remember God's declaration in Isaiah 55 that his thoughts are not our thoughts, and neither are his ways our ways. Just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are God's ways higher than our ways. Whenever we face a problem, we can choose to try and sort it out ourselves, or we can risk trusting God and following his plan. One of the Bible verses that I've come to lean on over the years is Proverbs 3:5, which says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." You know, I'm sure Ruth didn't really understand the strange Jewish custom of going and lying at Boaz's feet. But she took the risk of doing things God's way. And the Bible is full of people who took a risk. Moses' parents took a risk putting him in a basket on a river. David took a risk facing Goliath. Esther took a risk approaching the king and pleading for the Jews. Even Jesus himself took a risk with the disciples that he chose. And someone once said, faith is spelled R-I-S-K. And we have a whole chapter in Hebrews chapter 11 of people who took a risk and were commended for their faith. Doing things God's way often involves risk. Risk of living counterculturally. Risk of other people not understanding why we're doing something. Risk means stepping out with no guarantees. But when arcs are built, lives are saved. When soldiers march, Jerichos tumble. When staffs are raised, seas are opened. When a lunch is shared, thousands are fed. And we've heard this one already. When an anemic woman reaches out to touch the hem of a garment, healing is found. Yet in every single one of these situations, someone took a risk. Many of us don't like taking risks, and we've been bombarded with messages about staying safe, particularly during COVID. God has given us common sense, and we shouldn't take risks indiscriminately. But if we always do what we've always done, we'll always be where we've always been. In order to move forward, we have to risk stepping out of our familiar and safe comfort zones. Some people sat listening to this message at home need to take the risk of coming back to a Sunday service. Other people listening this morning need to take the risk of coming to God and committing to his purposes for their life, whether that's for the first time or the 21st time. Let me ask you this morning, in what area of your life is God prompting you to take some godly initiative, to take a risk, to step out in faith? Godly risk-taking isn't done out of pride or ignorance. It's done out of love for Jesus, out of a desire to put him first and commit to his plans, regardless of the outcome. In every story with a happy ending, someone has to take a risk. Or to quote the title of a famous book, if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out the boat. Notice in verse 15 of this chapter that Ruth returns from the threshing floor with a shawl full of barley. When we do things God's way, then we will enjoy the provision of God. In fact, one of the names that God is known by is Jehovah Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. And when we follow his plan, God will provide everything that we need. After I finished my A-levels, I went to Birmingham to train to become a physiotherapist. But I ended up in a psychiatric hospital in Liverpool with anorexia nervosa. Another patient just happened to be sat in the day room of my hospital ward reading a Bible. And he told me, "Helen, the nurses and doctors can't help you. The only person who can help you is Jesus Christ." Several days later, as I was laid in my hospital bed, I noticed in the little doors of my hospital locker a Bible, like the one the patient in the day room had been reading. I took the Bible out of the locker, just out of boredom. I flipped it open, and it just happened to fall open at Psalm 107. And the very first verse I read in the Bible said, "Some became fools through their rebellious ways. They suffered affliction because of their sins. They loathed all food and drew near the gates of death. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble. He saved them. He sent out his word and healed them. He rescued them from the grave." I threw the Bible on the bed as if I'd been electrocuted. How on earth could something that was written thousands of years ago be so relevant to my life? I too loathed all food and was drawing near the gates of death. And out of all the millions of verses in the Bible, how did the Bible just happen to fall open at that particular verse? I started thinking about God. Surprise, surprise. And shortly afterwards, I became a Christian at a Billy Graham event at Anfield Football Stadium in Liverpool. After 10 years of eating disorders and being obsessed by food and rebelliously proclaiming, "It's my body, I'll do what I like," I took a huge risk of offering my body to God as a living sacrifice, and I began to eat sensibly. Despite being told by Birmingham that I would never be a physio, God brought me to Teesside, a place I'd never even heard of. I qualified as a physio, and I met my husband, who, as it turned out, became a Christian at a Billy Graham event at Roker Park in Sunderland, the very same week that I had given my life to the Lord at Anfield. At the very start of our marriage, we committed not just to each other, but to living our lives for God, wherever that may take us. And at different stages, we both took the risk of leaving our secular jobs to follow God's purposes. When we had our 5th child, all of whom were born by cesarean, the surgeon came to see us and explained that my uterus, my womb, was paper thin, and it would be extremely dangerous to have any more children, as my uterus could rupture, not only resulting in an emergency hysterectomy, but in the possible death of the baby and of myself. She strongly recommended sterilization, and she explained all about male sterilization and female sterilization. And she suggested that male sterilization would be the best option because female sterilization was a bigger operation and carried a much higher risk of complications or failure. My husband, who was starting to look decidedly green at this point, says to the surgeon, "It's a risk we're willing to take. We'll go with the female sterilization." The surgeon told us to sort out the details for the sterilization when I attended my postnatal checkup with the GP. 6 weeks later, I'm going out of the front door, down to the GP for my postnatal checkup. And as I'm going out the door, the postman's coming up the path and he hands me a letter. And I'm just about to shove it through the letterbox thinking I'll read that later because I'm struggling with a double buggy. And as I glance at the envelope, in red writing on the envelope, it says, "Keep the door open for the 6th child." My hands start to shake. I open the envelope and I took out this leaflet. I think it's on the PowerPoint. It might be easy for you to see. And it's the 6th child appeal. We want to say yes. It was an appeal from the Bible Lands Missionary Society saying that for every 5 children they currently sponsor in a village, there's a 6th child knocking at the door, and that by giving a regular amount each month, I could help support the 6th child. The 6th child appeal. We want to say yes. I was on my way to make an appointment to get sterilized after having 5 children. I was grateful for the long walk to the doctors as it gave me time to pray and weigh up what God was saying. I'd never normally go against medical advice, but the timing and the specific nature of the letter made me think that I should take a risk and keep the door open for 6th child. And much to the surprise of the GP, I told him that although I fully understood the risk of a future pregnancy, I did not wish to undergo sterilization. We trusted God. Nothing happened for 4 years. But then I became pregnant. And our 4th child was born by cesarean, 6th child was born by cesarean nearly 19 years ago this month. My pregnancy was very high risk, and it wasn't without complications. But it was a risk I was willing to take because God had spoken so clearly. Yes, we took a risk having a 6th child when we already had several children with additional needs. We also took a risk when we moved from Eaglescliffe to Ragworth to plant an Eden project. I even took a risk agreeing to speak here this morning, as there are certain issues at home that regularly escalate and demand my full-time attention. But over the years, I've learned that if I put God first, if I seek to follow him and his plan and purpose, then he will indeed show himself to be Jehovah Jireh and provide all that's needed. Ruth was a widow and a foreigner who couldn't save herself. She understood from Naomi that Boaz was their only hope. Ruth took a huge risk and received the blessings that came from having a guardian redeemer. We don't use the word redeemer very often, but to redeem something simply means to buy it back. And I love the story about a little boy who built himself a wooden boat. He would sail it on the lake near his home. But one day, a strong breeze arose and blew the boat away. The boy was really upset, but several days later, he saw the boat in a nearby shop window. He went in and claimed it as his own. But despite his claims that he'd made the boat with his own hands, the shopkeeper said, "If you want it, you must pay for it." The little boy returned home, emptied his money box, and returned to the shop. He bought the boat back, and when he got it off from the shopkeeper, he looked at the boat proudly and said, "You're twice mine. I've made you, and I've redeemed you." And just like Naomi and Ruth, we too need a redeemer. We cannot save ourselves. Jesus Christ is our Boaz. He's our redeemer. He's made us, and he's redeemed us. We've been thinking about kingdom keys for challenging times. And if we stay faithful and follow God's plan, we too will move from emptiness to fullness, from destitution to security and hope. Ruth enjoyed the provision of Boaz by working in his fields. But when she took a risk and laid at his feet, she gained so much more. She became the great-grandmother of King David and ultimately part of the genealogy of Jesus. Problem, plan, provision. Whatever problem or challenging time you may be facing this morning, know that God has a plan. He will work all things together for good to give you hope and a future. And when you follow God's plan, he will provide all that's needed. Remember I told you about that show that my mum watches? Well, whenever someone goes for the low offer, my son walks out of the room in disgust, exclaiming, "What a waste." Even when they play safe and go for the middle offer, he shouts at the TV screen, "You're only on the show once. Why not go for it?" His comments remind me of a little rhyme. There was a very cautious man who never laughed or played. He never risked. He never tried. He never sang or prayed. And when one day he passed away, his insurance was denied. For since he never really lived, they claim he never really died. We only get one life on this earth. You can play it safe and miss out on all that God has in store for you. Or you can take hold of the kingdom keys of staying faithful, finding hope, and taking risk, and enjoy the abundant, multicolored life that Jesus Christ gives us. As the British missionary C.T. Studd said, "One life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last." Don't settle for the lower offer of a boring humdrum existence. Go for the big money. Step out in faith, follow God's plan, enjoy his provision, because I guarantee it's a risk worth taking.